Welcome back to Major Antonio's presentation of Sea Life in Nelson's Time by John Masefield. Chapter 3.
The captain of a man of war, on receiving his appointment to a ship, at once repaired on board her, wherever she then lay, first obtaining from the master attendant of the dockyard a new narrow pendant, a swallow-tailed piece of red and white bunting to hoist at her masthead. Having repaired on board and hoisted his pendant, the captain read his commission, or read himself in, before the caretakers and old seamen aboard the ship. He then set about fitting her for the sea, if she were a new ship, with all possible dispatch, and an admiralty order forbade his sleeping ashore, without express permission from his superiors, until his ship was paid off. He had to examine all guns, gun carriages, muskets, cutlasses, and small arms when they were hoisted on board, and to reject any faulty weapon. He had to keep inventories of all stores sent aboard, and counterparts of the inventories of his warrant officers, such as those of the boatswain and gunner. He kept an account of the ship's provisions, showing the daily expenditure of junk and spirits. He had to use his best endeavors to get the ship manned by the dispersal of alluring placards all over the town near which he lay, promising quick promotion, heaps of prize money, free rations, etc., to all who would enter. He was also expected to open a rendezvous at a sailor's tavern, where the master-at-arms and coxswain could blarney sailors into joining. Sometimes he was able to offer a bounty or money reward to every seaman who entered. If neither sugary announcements nor the offer of a piece of gold could lure men to the living death of a gun deck, he had to have recourse to the press. He would send his boats ashore after dark, in command of lieutenants or master's mates, to search the dockside brothels and sailors' taverns. Any sailors or seafaring folk discovered in these haunts were dragged from the arms of their trulls and taken aboard. Often the press gangs had to fight to bring off their men, for the women and bullies sometimes rallied to the rescue. Many a bold lieutenant had his cheek scratched or his hair pulled out, and many a bold terry-breeks got his head broken in these encounters. The gangs never took firearms on these excursions, but contented themselves with stretchers and cudgels, such as wooden belaying pins. They generally carried cutlasses, but more for their majesty to astonish the enemy than for actual use. Press gangs made great havoc among watermen and dockside laborers. They were expected primarily to capture sailors and seafaring people, but a man of war like a gallows refused nothing, and any landsmen served their turn. They were, at least, mortal men, and did as well as any others to stop a bullet or to feed powder. Marryat mentions a ship which was manned by the men of 19 nations, professing among them some 57 different trades. Tailors, little tradesmen, street loafers, all were fair game. They were taken to the boats and sent aboard, and cracked across the heads with a cudgel if they protested. When once on board, they were shoved down below decks, under a marine sentry who had orders to shoot them if they attempted to escape. When convenient, the captain examined these wretches as to their fitness for the sea service. He had them examined by the surgeon to make sure that they were not infested nor infected. Any man who appeared to be too sickly for the work was discharged. A dirty man was cleaned and his clothes fumigated. Apprentices who could produce their indentures or merchant sailors who could claim exemption were dismissed. All the others were carefully retained. Many pressed men made the best of a very hard bargain by offering to ship within a fortnight of their impressment. Those who acted thus were allowed the king's bounty, and won for themselves, to some extent, the good opinion of the officers. This way of impressing folk was but one of the ways by which a captain could get his fleet manned. Men condemned at the sessions were sometimes offered the hard alternative of the gallows or service afloat. Often they chose the greater of the two evils. Absconding debtors and those pursued by the redbreasts or Bow Street runners were frequently eager to ship to avoid capture. A number of men shipped because they had had their heads turned by sea songs or similar cant, describing the beauty of life afloat, etc. Large numbers were sent from London by the Lord Mayor. These were generally young bloods or bucks who had been found drunk in the streets or bawdy houses, and feared to see their names in the police magistrates' lists and police court reports. They were known as my Lord Mayor's men, and very bad bargains they generally were. It was reckoned that 1/3 of each ship's company was composed of landsmen, and that 1/8 of the entire number of men serving in His Majesty's ships were foreigners. Having got a crew together by these gentle means, the captain had to see to it that each man's name was entered in the ship's books, particularly the muster book, in which a sort of prison record was kept to enable the officers to identify deserters. The colors of a man's hair and eyes were noted. His chest measurement was taken. His tattoo marks were described. If the man deserted, these particulars were sent to the Admiralty with an account of the escape. The muster books were kept with great care and submitted every month or 2 months to the Admiralty. They contained, among other matter, the records of any deductions to be made from the pay of the members of the crew. At sea, the captain was responsible for the ship and for all on board her. He had to see that the lieutenant made out his quarter bills allotting the hands to their stations. He kept the keys of the magazines and saw to it that sentries guarded those places to prevent the entry of unauthorized persons. He had to be vigilant to prevent all possibility of fire by forbidding candles in the cable tiers or at the breaking out of spirits from the spirit room. He was to order all lights out at 8 p.m. each night. He was to forbid smoking in any other place than the galley. He was to see the men exercised at the great guns and with their small arms. He had to see that the colors were not kept abroad in windy weather. He had to keep a journal in duplicate for the benefit of the Admiralty, and at the end of a cruise he had to send an account of the qualities of his ship to the commissioners. He had charge of the sea stores known as slops, such as bedding and clothing, which he sold to those of the crew who needed them. He had to keep his ship clean, dry, and well ventilated by having the decks swept and scrubbed, the ports opened, the wells and bilges pumped, and windsails or ventilators fitted to expel the foul air from the hold. He was to punish transgressors, discourage vice and immorality, defend his country's honor, keep secret the private signals, and burn, sink, and destroy as much of the enemy as he could. These are but a few of the 48 duties required of him. The captain's share of prize money was 3/8 parts of the value of the prize. His pay varied from about 6 to 25 shillings a day, in accordance with the importance of his command. The captain of a 74 received 13 shillings 6 a day. Until 1794, he was allowed to have 4 servants for every 100 men aboard his ship, a regulation which afforded him an opportunity to provide for his friends and poor relations. A captain in the old time frequently put to sea with a little band of parasites about him. They stuck to him as jackals stick to the provident lion, following him from ship to ship, living on his bounty, and thriving on his recommendations. When one reads of a distinguished naval officer having been a captain's servant, it does not mean that he blacked the captain's boots, mixed his grog, and emptied his slops, but that he entered the service under a captain's protection. Nelson was a captain's servant to Captain Maurice Suckling on the guard ship at Chatham, but he was very far from being Captain Suckling's flunky. The system was bad and much abused, but it lingered until 1794, when it was abolished and a money compensation paid to the captains. It had been attended with a curious privilege. A captain removing from one ship to another was allowed to carry with him not only his servants, but his boat's crew, his coxswain, some of his warrant officers, his clerk and purser, and a number of able seamen. From a first-rate ship he could take in all 80 men, from a second-rate 65, from a third-rate 50, from a fourth-rate 40, from a fifth-rate 20, and from a sixth-rate 10. Those who have trembled under the command of a sea captain will not need to be told of his powers and dignities. A captain of a ship at sea is not only a commander, but a judge of the Supreme Court, and a kind of human parallel to deity. He is a Leviathan, says the scurrilous Ward, or rather a kind of sea god, whom the poor tars worship as the Indians do the devil. There was no appeal from a sentence pronounced by such an one. His word was absolute. He had power over his subjects almost to the life, that he could not touch without the consent of his equals, but he had the power to flog a man senseless and authority to break some of his officers and send them forward. He had power to loose and to bind, and perhaps no single man has ever held such authority over the fortunes of his subordinates as that held by a sea captain over his company at sea during the Napoleonic Wars. He lived alone, like a little god in a heaven, shrouded from view by the cabin bulkheads and guarded always by a red-coated sentry armed with a drawn sword. If he came on deck, the lieutenants at once shifted over to the lee side out of respect to the great man. No man on board dared to address him, save on some question relating to the duty of the day. No sailor could speak to him with his hat upon his head. One uncovered to one's captain as to one's god. When he came aboard, after a visit to the shore, he was received with honor. The side boys, dressed in white, rigged the green or red side ropes to the gangway and stood there at attention to await his arrival. The boatswain, in his uniform, went to the gangway to pipe the side, that is, to blow a solemn salute upon his whistle, as the august foot came on to the deck. The marine sentry stood to attention. A number of midshipmen and other officers and men fell in upon the quarterdeck. As the captain stepped on board, all hands uncovered. The ship became as silent as the tomb, save for the slow, solemn piping of the boatswain. The captain saluted the quarterdeck and passed aft to his cabin, generally paying not the very least attention to the assembled worshippers. The same ceremony was performed when the captain left the ship. The captain stood no watch and did not interfere with the ordinary working of the ship until something went wrong. He lived alone in his cabin, eating in solitude, save when he desired his lieutenants and midshipmen to dine with him. On these occasions he graciously unbent. Smollett has painted for us a brutal captain, and Marryat and Mitford have shown us a type which was, we trust, more common in the service. Some captains were, perhaps, the most cruel and tyrannical fiends ever permitted on the earth. There were never very many of this kind, but there were enough to make a number of our ships mere floating hells. They could single out and break the heart of any man whom they disliked. They could make life a misery to every man under them. They could goad a crew to mutiny, and then see them hanged at the yardarm. It was a little thing to captains of this stamp to cut the flesh off a man's back with the cat-o'-nine tails, swearing placidly, as the poor fellow writhed at the gratings, that, by God, he would show them who was captain, that he would see the man's backbone, by God. We know that other captains were respected and loved, and we read of ship's companies putting their shillings together to purchase silver plates, as keepsakes for such commanders, at the conclusion of a cruise. It must, however, be borne in mind that the sailors really preferred a man who was, in their terms, a bit of a Tartar. They liked to sail with a smart and strict seaman who knew his duty and made his men do theirs. They disliked slack captains as much as they disliked what they called rogues or tyrants. When a mild and forgiving captain came aboard a ship, either on a visit or to command her, there was little interest displayed. But when a rogue or a taut hand came alongside, there was a general rush to the ports to see the man. The state of the ship, the happiness of her crew, and the success of her voyage depended on the captain. In those days, every ship was a separate navy. Each captain had his own theories, and to some extent his own routine. He had also his own whims and fancies, with power sufficient to enforce them. Some captains took a delight in causing their crews to dress uniformly, in the slops supplied by the purser. Others took a great delight in inventing fancy uniforms for their coxswains and gig's crews. A smart captain liked to dress his gig's crew in some distinctive dress, such as scarlet frocks, white hats, blue trousers, and black handkerchiefs, or white and blue guernseys, with white jackets and small clothes. Some captains went to strange lengths to gratify their tastes. We read that the gig's crew of HMS Harlequin were dressed up as harlequins, in party-colored clothes, to the great delight of the rest of the ship's company. We are also told of a gig's crew in kilts, with Scottish bonnets on their heads and worsted thistles on their jackets. The captain's uniform varied a good deal during the 47 years of Nelson's life. At first, it was a blue coat with lace at the neck, blue lapels, white cuffs, and small flat gold buttons. A white-sleeved waistcoat, white knee breeches, and white silk stockings completed the dress. The hat was a three-cornered black hat edged with gold lace and bearing a cockade. At the time of Trafalgar, the lapels were white, the cuffs were striped with gold, the collar was stiff instead of drooping, and the waistcoat was no longer sleeved. A black cravat was worn about the throat. A straight dress sword was worn, but its form was not prescribed by the regulations. The hat was the ordinary cocked hat worn athwart ships. The hair was worn long, in a queue, tied with black silk ribbon. Powder or flour was used to dress this queue. It must be borne in mind that many captains wore pretty much what uniforms they pleased. Epaulettes came into use towards the end of the 18th century. They were of heavy gold stuff, hanging down in tassels from a central gold pad. Captains of over 3 years' rank wore them on both shoulders. The lieutenant, the officer next in power and rank to the captain, commanded in the captain's absence. A ship of the line carried from 3 to 8 lieutenants, who took precedence according to the dates of their commissions. The first lieutenant was a sort of captain's proxy, who did all the work in order that the captain might have the glory. He was responsible to the captain for the working of the ship, for the preservation of discipline, and for the navigation of the vessel from point to point, according to the captain's orders. He stood no watch at night when the ship was at sea, but he was expected to pass his days about the decks, and to come up in times of danger during the night watches. A lieutenant of the watch had to see that the helmsman kept the ship to her course, that the log was duly hove every hour, and that the rate of sailing was marked on the board. He had to see that the men were alert and smart, at their proper stations, and ready for any sudden order. He had to keep the midshipmen and master's mates to their duty. He had to muster the watch, to keep the ship in her station, and to report strange sails and shifts of wind. He was to see that the lookout men at the mastheads and elsewhere were awake, and were not kept too long at their stations. If at night, in wartime, a strange sail was sighted, he had orders to send a midshipman to the captain with the news. While the captain dressed, he got the ship ready for action, keeping her out of gunshot of the stranger, till all was ready. In the night, he had to take particular care that the master-at-arms and corporals made their regular half-hourly rounds of all parts of the ship, to see that there is no disturbance among the men, that no candles nor lamps are burning, except those which are expressly allowed, and that no man is smoking tobacco in any other place than the galley. Twice in each watch, a lieutenant had to send one of the carpenter's mates to sound the ship's well, and to see that the lower gun-deck ports were securely closed and barred. At the same time, he had to send the gunner's mates to examine the lashings of each gun and to reeve double tackles or breechings if the guns were straining. In the morning, he had to receive reports from the boatswain as to the state of the rigging and from the carpenter as to the state of the masts and yards. Any defects had to be reported to the captain. In addition to all these duties, he had to keep an eye on the admiral's signals, to answer them directly, his signalman reported them, and to record them carefully in the ship's log. At night, he had to see that lanterns were lit and unshotted guns loaded, in case night signals had to be made. He had also to see that the cabin windows and other ports were closed, so that the ship's lights might not be seen from a distance. In foggy weather, he had to order the fog signals, such as the firing of guns, beating on the drum, or striking of the ship's bell. He had to keep a logbook in the prescribed form, which volume he had to sign and submit to the Navy Board when he wished to receive his pay. In action, he commanded a battery of guns, and saw to it that the men kept at their quarters and fought their guns with spirit. He had to take especial care that no loose powder was strewn about among the guns, and that the gun captains took good aim at the enemy before firing. At all other times, he had to prevent all profane swearing and abusive language, all disturbance, noise, and confusion. He was to see that the men kept themselves clean by washing themselves frequently, that the hammocks were often scrubbed, and the frocks and trousers washed. Junior lieutenants had charge of the ship's muskets, and exercised the seamen in musketry. For about 80 out of every 100 sailors had to be instructed in the use of the musket, to fit them for fighting ashore, should the service require it. In the absence of the captain, the lieutenant commanding might put an officer under arrest or confine a man in irons, but he might not release nor punish any officer or man so confined, unless the captain were absent with leave from the Admiralty, i.e., for some considerable period during which the lieutenant held his power. Lastly, the lieutenant had to keep all boats from coming alongside or leaving the ship without his express directions. A lieutenant was often dispatched on a press gang to rout out the watermen and the sailors in the merchant vessels. When the ship has been sufficiently depopulated by ill usage, says Edward Ward, my spark is detached ashore with some choice hounds to go hunt out a fresh stock. He and his bandogs together make a woeful noise in all the seaport towns round the kingdom. He beats up all quarters and rummages all the whopping alehouses, as narrowly as he would a prize for the Indies. In fine, he's a perfect hurricane in a little town, and drives the laggard dog along the streets with as much noise and bustle as butchers do swine at Smithfield. The uniform of a lieutenant at the time of Trafalgar was as follows: a coat of a rather bright blue, with white cuffs, white lapels, gold anchor buttons, and long tails, was worn over a white cloth waistcoat, white knee breeches, and white stockings. The sword was slung in a belt worn over the shoulder. The hat was a three-cornered black hat with a cockade. It was generally worn athwartships. Though this was the prescribed costume, it was often departed from. Lord Dundonald mentions a first lieutenant who received him on his joining the navy. He was dressed in the garb of a seaman, with marline spikes slung round his neck and a lump of grease in his hand, and was busily employed in setting up the rigging. Captain Glasscock mentions another who was dressed in a blue white-edged coat, which displayed here and there a few straggling anchor buttons of different dyes, to which was added a buff, soup-spotted vest, a pair of tarred nankeen trousers, and an old battered broad-brimmed leathern hat. This homely habit was splashed with pitch and whitewash. Michael Scott mentions another as wearing a curious wee hat with scarcely any brim, a worn old coat, a dingy white kerseymere waistcoat, and a pair of ancient duck trousers. Next in rank to the lieutenant, and in early days his superior, was the master. His chief duty was to conduct the ship from port to port under the direction of the captain. He controlled the sailing of the ship, the trimming and setting of her sails, and the guidance of her movements during a battle. He had, moreover, the charge of the stowage of the hold. He had to repair aboard his ship before she shipped her iron and shingle ballast, for it was one of his duties to see that the ballast put aboard was sweet and clean and properly stowed. He had to superintend the shipping of the coals and firewood, and to note that a sufficient quantity was shipped to last the vessel for the period for which she was victualled. When provisions came on board, he had to examine them to prove their soundness. He had to stow old provisions on the top so that they might be eaten first. He had the care of the cable tiers and spirit room, and had strict orders not to allow a naked light to be carried into the latter place, lest the fumes of the rum and brandy should take fire. On no account whatsoever was he to quit the after-hold while it was open. He had charge of the water casks, but he was not allowed to pump out fresh water for the use of the crew without the captain's express commands. Every evening he had to examine all beer and water casks in order to report to the captain the quantity of water and beer remaining. He had to examine the cables to see that they were dry and clean and clear for running. He had to keep the anchor clear when the ship rode to single anchor. He had to see that the standing rigging was well set up and in good condition. He had to check the boatswains' and carpenters' accounts. He had to overhaul the sails in the sail rooms to see that they were dry, in good order, not damaged by rats. Every day he had to find the ship's position, both by dead reckoning and by the altitude of celestial objects. When in foreign waters, near a coast, it was his duty to survey the inlets from one of the ship's boats, keeping a most careful record of all soundings and bearings taken. He was to compare his own observations with those marked on the printed charts supplied to him. At noon, when he took the height of the sun, he had to call up his mates, with a proportion of midshipmen, with their quadrants, both to assist him and to teach them their business. He had to superintend the writing of the logbook by his mates, who entered up all details of the weather, ship's position, expenditure of stores, and daily happenings, etc., from the reports and records of the ship's officers. When the ship was in need of rope, it was his duty to attend at the rope walk to see the rope made, in order that the rope maker should not waste his rope yarns. Many masters sought to improve their pay by qualifying as pilots for some of the home and foreign ports. First, second, and third-rate ships carried what were known as second masters, while ships of all rates carried master's mates to assist the master in the dirtier parts of his business. These master's mates had to write up the logbook, keep the foreyards trimmed, heave the log each hour or half hour, and keep the rates of the chronometers. They had also to attend in the hold when casks were being shifted. They were responsible for the discharge of various minor duties during their night watches. In port, they sent the midshipmen on periodical tours round the ship to attend to the house and to keep the men from lounging along the gun decks. At night, at sea, they generally called the relieving lieutenant at the end of a watch. During the daytime, a master's mate took charge of the lower deck and forbade wrangling in the galley or disorderly bawling about the waist and the washing of clothes on days not set apart for that duty. He had to see that the cables and cable gear were in good order, that the wash deck buckets were in their places, and that sand boxes or tin spittoons were always placed in the galley for the convenience of smokers. Another master's mate kept watch upon the main deck to keep the deck as clear as possible and to superintend all duty done in the waist. He had to keep the topsail sheets clear for running, to attend the serving out of the beef and the mixing of the wine and spirits. A master's mate kept a record of the messes for the assistance of the first lieutenant. He had to see to the numbering of the hammocks, the fixing of the hammock battens, the lashing and slinging of the hammocks, and the carrying of the scrubbed hammocks to the clotheslines on deck. He had to attend the early dinner at 11:30 in the forenoon, when the helmsmen, sentries, and lookout men who came on duty at 12 had their food served out to them half an hour before the rest of the crew. Lastly, he was in command of the port lids and had to see them properly sloped, closed, or opened according to the state of the weather, with the port sills clear of sailors' property, such as hats or handkerchiefs. A master's uniform was practically the same as the captain's, save that the lapels and cuffs were blue instead of white. A master's mate wore a plain blue frock with gold anchor buttons. The white knee breeches and white kerseymere waistcoats were supposed to be worn by both ranks. Master's mates were often too poor to obey the strict letter of the regulation. They wore what clothes they had and were not ashamed to purchase seamen's gear from the slop chest. Midshipmen, who were a step lower in the ship than master's mates, were generally taken aboard ships of war by the captains commanding. They owed their appointments to interest. The captains took them to oblige their relations, or in return for the canceling of a tradesman's bill, or to curry favor with an influential family. As a rule, a midshipman was entered directly aboard the ship as a first-class volunteer, in which case he had to serve 2 years before he became full midshipman. But by passing 2 years at the Naval Academy at Gosport, the young man was enabled to ship as a midshipman on his first going to sea. In Nelson's time, midshipmen sometimes began their sea service at the age of 11, or even younger. After 1812, no boy was born on a ship's books until he was 13. An exception was admitted in favor of the sons of officers, who were allowed to be entered at the age of 11. A first-rate ship carried 24 midshipmen, a second-rate, 18, a third-rate, 12, and fourth and fifth rates a proportionate number. The midshipmen of sixth rates and unrated vessels were despised and looked down upon as a low lot not to be recognized by those in crack ships. Until the age of 15, the first-class volunteers or midshipmen were called youngsters. They slung their hammocks in the gunroom and messed, as a rule, by themselves, under the supervision of the gunner, who kept their clothes in order and catered for them. In frigates, it would seem as though they went at once to the steerage to mess with their seniors. Those of them who were not perfect in their navigation, nautical astronomy, and trigonometry were taught, every forenoon from 9 till 12 by a duly certificated schoolmaster who drilled them very carefully in the sea arts and sciences. The schoolmaster was expected to reprove and repress the slightest immoral tendency his pupils displayed. He had also strict orders to report the idle and vicious to the captain. The schoolmaster was nearly always the ship's chaplain, who received £5 from every midshipman he instructed. In those ships which carried neither schoolmaster nor chaplain, the captain himself taught the youngsters, and made them bring up their quadrants to take the sun at each noon, and refused to let them sup until they had worked out the ship's position by dead reckoning or the altitude of the sun. When the school hours were over and the ship's position found, the youngsters were sent on deck in their respective watches to learn their duty. They were looked upon as the slaves of the first lieutenant, who generally used them as messengers. They were usually employed on boat service and sent to and fro in the ship's boats when the ship was in port. When at sea, they had to mix much with the men in order to learn their duty. They were expected to keep order when the men were at the braces or aloft, or at general quarters, and to report those who were idle, noisy, or absent. They had to stand their watch at night like the lieutenant, but as the officers were divided into 3 watches, which had 8 hours below to every 4 hours on deck, this was not a very terrible hardship. They had to see the hammocks stowed in the morning, and to report those sailors whose hammocks were badly lashed. They had strict orders not to lounge against the guns or ship's sides. They were not allowed to walk the deck with their hands in their pockets. Some captains made the midshipmen responsible for the working of the mizzenmast and sent them aloft to furl the mizzen royal and mizzen topgallant sail whenever sail was shortened. The midshipmen were expected to go aloft with the men to learn how to furl or reef a sail, how to bend and unbend canvas, how to set up rigging, and all the other arts of seamanship. Midshipmen were always stationed in each top when sails were being furled, in order to cheer up the men to a lively performance of their duty. Other duties given to them were the supervision of the hoisting in of stores, the command of watering parties, mustering the men at night, watching the stowing or cleaning of the hammocks, and generally fetching and carrying for their commander and tyrant, the first lieutenant. In the night watches they had to keep awake upon the quarter-deck, to heave the log and mark the board, and to be ready to run any errand for the officer of the watch. When they had reached the age of 15 and had been duly rated as midshipmen, they became oldsters, with increased pay, freedom from the schoolmaster, and an allowance of grog. At this stage they shifted from the gun-room into the midshipman's berth on the orlop deck, in the after cockpit, where they messed with the past midshipmen, who had qualified as lieutenants and awaited promotion, and with the master's mates. After another 2 years, they were qualified to take the examination for master's mates, provided they had perfected themselves in navigation and in seamanship. At the age of 19, if they could prove that they had had 6 years of sea service, they were allowed to go before the Navy Office examiners, or a quorum of 3 sea captains, to be examined as to their fitness for the post of lieutenant. It was not essential that they should first have passed the examination for master's mate, but many midshipmen took this preliminary step, as it qualified them to navigate prizes into port. The pay of a midshipman varied in the different rates. Aboard a first rate, he received £2, 15 shillings, 6 pence a month. Aboard a third rate, £2, 8 shillings, and aboard a sixth rate, a bare £2. A first-class volunteer received £9 a year, from which 5 were deducted for the schoolmaster. It was essential that a first-class volunteer or midshipman should have private means. For a volunteer, some £30 or £40 per annum was considered sufficient. For a midshipman, the necessary annual sum ranged from £70 to £100, according to the station on which his ship served. Foreign stations, owing to the ruinous exchange, were more expensive than the Channel or the Mediterranean. The sum, whatever it was paid in advance to the captain's agent, particularly in the case of the youngsters, so that the captain was able to check extravagance among the boys and to keep them from vice and idleness when the ship was in port. A midshipman wore a dirk or hanger when in uniform. His working coat was cut short, like the round blue jacket of a man-of-war's man. His uniform was a blue tailcoat lined with white silk. It was of good blue cloth, ornamented with small gold anchor buttons, and with a white patch on the collar, known as a turnback or a weekly account. His breeches and waistcoats were of thin jean or white nankeen. His hat was three-cornered, high and smart, with a gold loop and a cockade. For foul weather, he had a glazed hat. Round his neck he wore a black silk handkerchief. His shoes were black. His shirts were of frilled white linen. In heavy weather he wore a frieze overall, known as a watchcoat, and waistcoats of scarlet kerseymere. This was the ideal, or prospectus, midshipman of the sort the poor child imagined before he came up a ship's side. There were other kinds. After a long absence from port, when the lad's clothes were worn out or stolen, or borrowed, he had to purchase clothes from the slop chest or go in rags. The boys seemed to have been treated with the utmost laxity. In many ships they were allowed to be slovenly. We read of a midshipman coming onto the quarterdeck with only one stocking, with a dirty shirt, torn coat, and wisps of straw in his shoes. For the rough sea service this attire was quite fine enough, and a down-at-heel appearance was not reckoned disgraceful. When asked to dine with his captain, the mid, took greater pains with his appearance, and borrowed from all who would lend, in order to appear neat. In battle and when at sea, he wore his oldest and dirtiest rags. For boat service, he was required to dress with greater nicety, in order that the honor of the ship might be maintained among the shoregoers. A midshipman's mess was not a pleasant place. It was generally below the water, in the after cockpit, in a dingy den, lit partly by a lantern and partly by a thick glass scuttle, crusted with filth, let into the ship's side. From deck to beam it measured perhaps 5 feet 6 inches, so that its inhabitants had to uncover as they entered it to avoid crushing their hats against the ceiling. 12 feet square was reckoned fairly large for a berth. Any berth big enough for a fight when the chests had been cleared away was looked upon as roomy. The atmosphere so far below water and the upper air was foul and noisome. The bilges reeked beneath the orlop in a continual pestilential stench, unlike any other smell in the world. Near the berth, as a sort of pendant to the bilges, was the purser's storeroom, where the rancid butter and putrid cheese were served out once or twice a week to the ship's company. Farther forward were the cable tiers, with the tarry, musty smell of old rope always lingering over them. In many ships, a windsail or ventilator led from the deck to the berth to relieve the midshipman with a little fresh air. There was not much furniture in the midshipman's mess. Nearly all had a table, not from any generosity of the government, but because the table was wanted for the surgeons in their operations after battle. This table, at mealtimes, was covered with a cloth or old hammock, which had to last a week. The cloth was used at mealtimes as a dishcloth and knife and fork cleaner. At meals, the table was lit by tallow dips or purser's glims, stuck in beer or blacking bottles. After meals, and for state occasions, the green cloth, a strip of dirty baize, was substituted. For seats, the young gentlemen used their chests. There was no decoration on the walls or bulkheads of a berth. Nails hung with clothing, quadrants, boxing gloves, single sticks, hangers, etc., were the only decorations ever known there. Some berths may have had lockers to contain their gear, bread barge, table utensils, and sea stores. Some may have had a tank to hold the allowance of fresh water. The berth was kept clean by a mess boy, a dirty, greasy lad unfit for anything else. This worthy washed the weekly tablecloth and saw to the cooking. All midshipmen were blessed with other servants, known as hammock men. These were either old sailors or marines who compounded to lash and stow and carry down and unlash the young gentleman's hammock for the sum of a glass of grog, payable each Saturday night. For further considerations of grog or tobacco, the hammock man sometimes washed the young gentleman's shirts while the ship was at sea. In port, the linen went ashore to some reputable or disreputable washerwoman who was lucky indeed if she saw the color of her money. The berth was the home of the elder midshipmen, the master's mates, the captain's clerk, and at times the assistant surgeons. As some of the midshipmen, in nearly all ships, were nearer 40 than 20, and as many of the master's mates were gray-headed men, the berth was not the place for little boys, especially when the rum was flowing towards 8 p.m. The elders seemed to have understood as much, for they had a custom of sticking a fork in the table, or in the beams above it, directly the first watch was set. As soon as the fork was in its place, every youngster and youth at once retired to his hammock, so that the old grizzled veterans had the board to themselves. Probably they were good-hearted fellows in the main, if a little rough from the life, and a little soured by their long and unrewarded service. But, if one or two writers may be trusted, their conversation was not well calculated to improve the mind. Indeed, in one or two ships, the veterans had a rule that no one should join their nightly rum drinkings till he had passed an examination in vice. Youngsters who disregarded the signal of the fork were given a few minutes' grace, after which the signal was repeated. If the geese remained in the berth after the second signal, they were colted or whipped with a knotted cord, and flicked with twisted handkerchiefs till they scattered out to their hammocks. The food served out to the young gentlemen was the same as that issued to the men. The king's provisions were generally supplemented by little niceties, purchased in port by the caterer of the mess. This worthy was usually a master's mate of some authority in the berth. Each member of the mess paid him from 3 to 5 pounds on joining the ship, and about 1 pound a month while the ship was in commission. The caterer expended this money as he thought fit. Before leaving England, he used to lay in a great supply of potatoes and onions, which he stowed in the lockers, or under the table, or in strings dangling from the beams. Dutch cheeses, for the manufacture of a midshipman's luxury called crab, were also purchased, together with tea and coffee and small stores such as pepper and sugar. In port, the caterer purchased soft tommy or shore bread and boxes of red herrings. The ship's allowance of spirits was so very liberal that it was not necessary to add to it. A pint of navy rum a day was sufficient, or should have been sufficient, for any man. Captain Chamier, Captain Marryat, Jack Mitford, Captain Sinclair, Captain Glasscock, Augustus Broadhead, and the author of The Navy at Home have all painted vivid pictures of the life in the midshipman's berth. It was rough and ready and sufficiently brutal. There was a good deal of noisy horseplay, a good deal of vice and cruelty, and a little fun and sea philosophy to allay its many miseries. A midshipman lived on monkey's allowance, more kicks than halfpence, and had to put up with bullying and injustice unless he was strong enough to hold his own. A weakling was robbed of his fair allowance of food and imposed upon in other ways, as by tardy relief at night, after keeping his watch on deck, etc. A thin-skinned or sensitive boy was out of his element in such a place. There was no privacy aboard a man of war. A student or scholar had little opportunity for reading. Down in the berth, during the daytime, there was a continual Dover court, all talkers and no hearers, so that study there was out of the question. A midshipman was continually fighting, quarreling, or playing the fool. The berth was a sort of bear garden, a kind of sea Alsatia, which not even the captain would control or keep in order. From the central darkness of the steerage, many cutting-out expeditions were organized against the captain's steward or the purser, or anyone with anything eatable or drinkable. The berth was always the noisiest and most lawless place aboard. With fiddling, singing, shouting, and fighting the mid passed his leisure. He was careless of all things save his dinner and his sleep. As for his duty, one has but to consult the authorities to see how he regarded that. According to Lord Cochrane's lieutenant, there was no such a thing as a faultless midshipman. According to others, the breed thought of nothing but gormandizing, and were so greedy that, though God might turn their hearts, the very devil could not turn their stomachs. The young gentlemen were seldom out of hot water. The usual punishment inflicted on them was mast-heading, by which a lad was sent to the topmast or topgallant crosstrees for several hours at a time. This punishment was often the cause of the loss of a meal, for no member of the berth thought of the absent one at the division of the meat or soup at dinner. In some cases, a mid was mast-headed for a full 24 hours, during which time he had to depend on the topman for his meat and drink, if he failed to steal down privily to lay in a stock. The punishment of mast-heading in sunny latitudes was not very severe. Most midshipmen used to look upon it as a pleasant relaxation. They could lash themselves to the cross trees and fall asleep there during daylight in fine weather, while at night they could creep down unobserved to the top to take a nap on the studding sails after telling the topmen to answer for them if hailed from the deck. Some lieutenants took a shorter way with midshipmen. They would lash or spread eagle the offender in the weather rigging, some half a dozen ratlines above the hammock nettings. In this position, with his face to windward and his arms and legs widely stretched, the midshipman cooled in the wind for an hour at a time, with the spray sprinkling him at brief intervals. This was severe punishment, usually given for sleeping while on watch. Another punishment for the same offense was dousing, or drenching the offender with a bucketful of water poured from a height. This was known as grampusing, or making him a soused gurnet. Some captains even went so far as to order the boatswain's mate to rig a grating in the cabin, and to lay the offending midshipman either on that grating or on a convenient gun, and to give him a dozen with a colt or knotted rope's end. Jack Mitford mentions a case of this sort, and a case occurred on the Australian station in the early 40s. In the latter case, the offending captain was court-martialed and severely reprimanded, which was nuts to every midshipman in the service. The midshipman's berth was governed partly by the strong arm and partly by certain laws designed to give an air of justice to the cruelty they recommended. Any member of the mess caught eating or drinking rum in the berth on the day on which he dined in the cabin or wardroom was sentenced to be firked or cobbed with a stockingful of sand, a knotted rope, or a cask's bung stave. In extreme cases, faulty relief, by which a lad was kept on deck after his watch was out, was punished in the same way. Anyone caught taking an unfair share of the rum was firked or cobbed, provided that he was not too big a man to tackle. As for amusements, one did not come to sea for pleasure. It is significant that the chief amusement or game in use in the midshipman's berth was able wackets, a pastime in which cards, blasphemy, and hard knocks were agreeably mingled. Other amusements they had none, save that old one, mentioned by Cervantes, of laughing at seasick persons. A green hand or Johnny Newcomb was fair sport for his first few days aboard, but tying knots in a lad's sheets, or putting a slippery hitch upon his hammock lanyard, or stowing round shot and swabs under his blankets, soon failed to amuse the jokers. Cutting a man down as he slept, hiding his trousers in the oven in the galley, sending him to the top to gather gooseberries, or to hear the dogfish bark, or to get the key of the keelson, or to find Cheeks the marine. All of these little tricks were jests of the sea humorist, designed to sharpen the wits of the greenhorn. Borrowing a new chum's clothes was a more questionable piece of humor, for the lender seldom saw his gear again, unless he had sufficient strength to back his claim. Making a newcomer drunk on Navy rum and sending him on deck with a message to the officer of the watch was yet another jest. There were one or two others, which we will forbear to mention. A midshipman was expected to turn out of his hammock at 7:30 every morning. If he hesitated and lingered on the order and turned like the sluggard, instead of showing a leg, he was very promptly cut down and hauled from his blankets by main force. When he had turned out, he washed himself in a little tin basin balanced on the lid of his chest. He was allowed to wash every day, unless the supply of fresh water was running short. He then dressed and blacked his boots and cleared up his sleeping quarters, so that the breakfast table should not be littered with blacking brushes, soap, or wet towels. At 8, he took his breakfast of tea and biscuit, or cocoa and porridge. At 9, he went to the schoolmaster. Although many midshipmen were mere children, they had extraordinary privileges, which they abused extraordinarily. They were officers, and therefore powerful. A midshipman had power to bully and maltreat all those beneath him. Aboard HMS Revenge, just before Trafalgar, under a captain so strict and just as Robert Morsum, there was a midshipman who amused himself by climbing on to gun carriages and calling to him the strongest and finest of the sailors. It was this little devil's pleasure to kick and beat the poor fellows without cause. He was an officer, and to resent his cruelty would have been mutiny. A midshipman had but to complain to a lieutenant to get a man a flogging at the gangway. He had full leave and license to curse and misname any seaman who displeased him. It was in his power to follow a man day after day, visiting him with every oppression that malice could suggest. The seaman had no remedy. Appealing to Caesar, the captain, was worse than useless. The man had to grin and bear it, and count himself lucky if he escaped the cat o' nine tails. "By the god of war," said Sir Peter Parker to his seamen, "by the god of war, I'll make you touch your hats to a midshipman's coat if it's only hung on a broomstick to dry." There was no redress to be gained from men holding opinions of that kind.
This concludes today's reading of Sea Life in Nelson's Time, presented by Major Intonio. Join us also next week for the subsequent chapter, or download the entire audiobook from our web shop at intonio.net. Thank you for listening, and so long.